So thank you very much. I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Nativity, of course, and I will be romping through a whole bunch of content. There is so much to say about the Nativity that I will necessarily have to just rattle through this like a bad case of verbal diarrhea. But I hope that you'll get something out of it, and please, ask some questions at the end and interact. So I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint. Now, first rule of Public Talk Club is don't show PowerPoints with lots of words on that are very boring for the audience. Second rule of Public Talk Club is that if you have a tendency to forget what you're saying, have a PowerPoint with lots of words on to remind you what to say. And rule 2 is more important than rule 1. So apologies for that. This is more for me than for you. Just as a caveat, I've got primary progressive multiple sclerosis. So if I lose a word here or there and stumble on what I'm going to say next, I'm going to pull out the disability card. It's not that I'm just useless and can't remember what I'm supposed to say, or something like that. But anyway, so here we go. Let me share with you this, and hopefully you can see that. So the Nativity, this is a romp through some critical analysis of the biblical infancy narratives. Now, it's going to be wise for me to say, well, actually, what happens in the Bible, first of all? You have probably been to see a nativity play from a child or a relative, or you may have been in one yourself as a kid, maybe the back end of a donkey or something. The question is, what happened in the nativity story? We have this story appearing in only 2 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew and Luke. And let me just very quickly set out to you what happens in each story, because they are completely different. The only similarities they have are: 1, Jesus is born by a virgin birth in Bethlehem. 2, Jesus and family eventually move to Nazareth. Those are the only 2 claims that are the same in each account. Matthew, well, I'm going to start with Luke. Luke has Jesus or Joseph and Mary going from Nazareth to Bethlehem to be born, and then straight back up to Nazareth. And that's really important. It's Nazareth, Bethlehem, Nazareth. Matthew has a completely different story. Matthew has Jesus being born in Bethlehem, as Luke does, but Joseph and Mary already live in Bethlehem. Or if they don't live in Bethlehem, they definitely don't live in Nazareth. So they appear to be living in Bethlehem. There's no traveling involved. The Magi come along, and the Magi follow that star to Jerusalem. They lose the star. They pick up Herod. Herod says, come back and tell me where Jesus is born, and I want to praise him. He trusts them. They go down to Bethlehem. They praise Jesus. They get a dream sequence that warns them not to go back to Jerusalem, and they go back to the east their own way, never to be heard from again after giving their gifts. Joseph and Mary are in Bethlehem, and Herod, meanwhile, comes down to Bethlehem, slaughters children up to the age of 2 in the hope that he kills this upstart king that he believes will usurp his throne. And Joseph and Mary run away to Egypt, and then they come out of Egypt a couple of years later after Herod has died, Herod the Great, to fulfill a prophecy that they come out of Egypt. Herod dies and leaves his son Herod Archelaus in charge as tetrarch of Judea. Joseph and Mary come out of Egypt. They don't fancy moving back to Bethlehem because it's still dangerous, and Herod Archelaus isn't a very nice guy, so they move up to Nazareth for the first time. Those are the 2 stories, and what you get when you go to a nativity play is you see both of these stories smashed together. So imagine Luke and Matthew. These 2 Gospels are going in very different directions. Imagine they are 2 cars traveling in different directions. Imagine these 2 cars smashed together so that all the parts of the cars are intermingled. And you come along and look at this car and say, 2,000 years later, goodness me, isn't that incredible? Cars in those days had 2 steering wheels, 4 wheels, and 2 windscreens. That's a funny looking car, but that's one coherent car. But actually, the reality is that's what happens when you take two different vehicles and smash them together. We have two different gospel accounts that are smashed together. And Christians, as a result of seeing them smashed together, try and harmonize the differences to make it work as one coherent narrative. But it is not one coherent narrative. The question is, why are these two accounts so different? Matthew and Luke are the only two accounts that have them, and they generally agree on what they say throughout their gospel narrative of the life of Jesus, but they disagree vehemently on the infancy narrative. Why is that? Well, I think the best theory to explain the differences is that Luke 1 and 2 is a later interpolation. That means it never existed originally in the Gospel of Luke. So Matthew came and wrote his gospel, and he and Luke used Mark, the earliest gospel, and this unknown source that people think was used called Q. Not everyone agrees, but generally it's thought that Matthew and Luke both used Mark and Q, and they formed their gospels. And it seems that Matthew, around about the same time they wrote, it seems that Matthew created an infancy narrative, but Luke didn't. And it was added later on. Luke was used by a heretic called Marcion at the time, or a little bit after he wrote. And Marcion and his Marcionites used Luke's gospel as their Bible. And the earliest versions of Luke that we have, the Evangelion, which is a Marcionite version of Luke, did not have Luke 1 and 2. So it didn't have the infancy narratives. So it looks like it has been tacked on. Some people think it was tacked on by Luke himself later as a kind of afterthought, maybe as a reaction to the Marcionites. Some people think it was added by later scribes and writers. Either way, this, I think, best explains why Luke and Matthew are so different at the beginning, but cohere so much as they go on. Now, what do we know about how the Gospels were written? The thing is, they are unknown authors. We call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but that's almost certainly not their names. They're written in a different language, Greek, not the Aramaic that Jesus used. They're written in unknown places using unknown sources. They're written with no recognized historical methodology. That is to say, and this is called historiography, this kind of techniques that historians used. In ancient writing, you had people like Polybius, Arrian, and Thucydides, these generally pretty okay historians by our standards today, probably not very good, but the best of those days. And they discussed their sources and discussed how they generated their history. Then you had worse historians like Suetonius, Plutarch, and Xenophon, who really weren't very good. Suetonius was known as a gossip monger, right? But he was a historian, and he still discussed his sources. So when he discussed the birth of Caesar Augustus, he talked about where he got these different theories from and settled for this one. This was an oral tradition, that's not very good. This was anonymous, that's not very good. Matthew and Luke are below those two layers of historians. They are not historians, and they use literally no historiographical techniques to do their writing. They are evangelists, which is to say they were trying to persuade the reader to believe a certain thing, to evangelize. They are what are called ex post facto writers. They already believe that Jesus was the Messiah and then come to write the account of Jesus's life. So they are trying to persuade the author of a particular thing. Therefore, they will have huge biases. There are also these techniques such as midrash, or in this case, almost reverse midrash. Midrash was this way of reinterpreting rabbinic or Jewish stories or the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in new ways to make the stories come alive. So there's elements of this within Matthew and Luke. But it's almost reverse midrash, where they're using the Old Testament and whacking it onto Jesus to validate the claims of Jesus. And I'll explain that later. So what you have when you're looking at the gospel accounts is very unreliable sources. And you have a maxim that says extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So, for example, I'll say, Maureen, who's there, I can see Maureen. Maureen, I was out in my garden this morning, wondering what I was going to say tonight. I mean, I take it you believe I was in my garden, Maureen. Yeah, she's nodding her head as if to say, I've got no reason to disbelieve that you were in your garden. That's a pretty believable. It's not extraordinary. I don't need much evidence. Your assertion that you're in your garden is good enough for me. But if I said to Maureen, I was in my garden wondering what to say, and I had a word to my talking dragon, Sheila, who every Tuesday flies to the moon and back singing Rule Britannia. Maureen would, I hope, go, that's bonkers. I don't believe you on your assertion alone. I will need much greater evidence in order to believe you in your claims. It seems to be self-evidently the case that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They require more evidence to be believed than just standard claims. So when you're looking at the gospel claims of a miraculous virgin birth, of the king of the area killing children, of a miraculous star, of Magi from the east, and then the life of Jesus doing miracles, and then dying and resurrecting, and all this stuff that's in the Gospels, you would have to have superb evidence, truly stupendous evidence, to justify believing those claims. The question is this stupendously good evidence? And the answer should be, I think, if you're honest enough, no, the level of evidence from the Gospels is not good enough. Right? I don't believe similar sorts of evidence from the Quran, from the Hadith, from other miracle claims throughout history and throughout the world. Why is it important that I'm analysing this critically? Well, if you think of Jesus's birth and Jesus's death and resurrection, these are two areas of his life that intersect with history. You can verify whether the birth happened and the resurrection happened as claimed, because we have other elements that we can test this against, verify against. Now, if you find these fall down, the rest of Jesus's life in the middle, what right do you have to believe that? What epistemic right? So epistemology is the study of knowledge. How can you believe the wedding of Cana happened, which has no facts that you can verify? Who was there? Where was this? When was this? How do we know that the miracle happened? It doesn't intersect with history, so it's merely just an assertion. But the birth and death of Jesus, we have burial customs, we have Pontius Pilate at the death, we have Herod, we have Quirinius, we have all these claims that intersect with history. We can check that. And if they fail, the whole thing falls down like a house of cards, in my opinion. So it's really, I think, quite an important pastime to do this. Now, what Christians will say is they will rely on something that I call possibiliter ergo probabiliter. I nicked that off a chap called Richard Carrier. Now, this is a sort of fallacy that says, if it's possible, therefore it's probable, which is to say, if I can give an answer how this might be worked out, if it's conceptually possible, then I'm thinking that's probable and that's actually what happened. A bit like saying aliens did it. Yeah, conceptually, possibly aliens could come down and do whatever you want them to do, but did they? Is there evidence for that? No, they did it. I mean, it's possible, therefore they did it. And that's the jump. The jump from possible to most probable is a really problematic jump that you see a lot of Christians do, particularly in the nativity harmonization attempts. So let's rattle through the issues. Virgin birth. Problem number 2. Miraculous births were 10 a penny. Jesus had to compete with Caesar Augustus. He was a ruler at the time of the Roman Empire. He had a miraculous birth, apparently. And so if Jesus was to compete, if the evangelists were to persuade pagans in the Roman Empire to believe the Christian account, he will have to be at least as good as Caesar Augustus. Not only that, but John the Baptist had a miraculous birth in Luke just before Jesus. So if he had a miraculous birth and Jesus just had a bog standard birth, you're going to be thinking, well, he's not even as good as John the Baptist. So in my opinion, Jesus would have to have a miraculous birth to be seen in the light in which his followers would expect him to be seen. But when you look at Paul, who's the earliest source of the Bible, the Apostle Paul, he wrote before the Gospels. He didn't mention Bethlehem. He didn't mention a virgin birth or any miraculous birth. He didn't mention the birth at all. Mark, the earliest gospel, nothing about the birth. He has Jesus coming from Capernaum, somewhere else. When you look at John, he implies a normal birth as well. The fourth gospel, the latest. So it's very suspicious when in the Bible, only 2 sources recount the birth, and they are both contradictory and completely different. The next problem Well, okay, with the virgin birth, we can see that already at the time an anti-Christian called Celsus, who was a Jew, anti-Christian Jew, who was arguing back against all the claims that Christians were making at the time, back in around, I think about maybe in second century sometime, 135 maybe around there. But Origen, an early church father, we know only about Celsus from Origen's answers to Celsus. So he was recounting what Celsus was saying to argue against Christianity, and he attempted to rebut Celsus, and he wrote about that. So that's how we know about Celsus. But Celsus was saying, well, Mary was raped by a Roman soldier, Pantera, and that explains like the virgin birth, the idea that it wasn't Joseph, and you can almost imagine, right? Imagine Julian gets in one day from work, doing his carpentry, and his partner's like, "Oh, hi, Julian, but I've got something to say. I'm pregnant." And Julian goes, "What? But we've had a couple of barren months. It definitely wasn't. It's not Bob next door, is it? You haven't. That's Bob, isn't it? No, no, no." She says, "No, Julian. It's God. It's God what did it." And Julian or Joseph goes, "Yeah, that's fine. Okay, no worries. Yeah, I believe you." So you can imagine Jews at the time would be going, "Well, I wouldn't be so believing." And then you can see that theories come into play. Whether they're based on truth or not is difficult to know. But a prevailing theory at the time was that a Roman soldier ended up, raping Mary, and this is perhaps how the myth came about. It's interesting that Justin Martyr, who's an early church father, actually this was in 135, he has a big old quote that basically states, I'll paraphrase, "I believe in the virgin birth, even if most Christians at the moment don't," which is to say that contemporary Christians of shortly after the events didn't believe the virgin birth claim. And so, why should we 2000 years later suddenly take merely two asserted gospels as gospel truth? I'm not going to go through all these, but contemporary mythology has lots of cases of miraculous births for divine figures. And in fact, lots of people have done work on connecting loads of other similarities with the infancy narratives. Christians will point out these aren't perfect parallels, and there is always arguments between what are called comparative mythology, comparative mythologians, if that's a word, mythologists, and Christians, and they will argue quite vociferously about whether the contemporary mythology parallels are accurate or not. But suffice to say that it seems that this is a very common motif, a miraculous birth. But the virgin birth problem is made somewhat worse because it turns out that the Hebrew Bible was first translated into Greek, supposedly in a miraculous event that brought about the Septuagint. Okay, where I think something like 72 was it, or 70 people miraculously came up with the same Greek translation at the same time, and hence the Septuagint. But what Matthew does is he uses a so-called prophecy that isn't really a prophecy from the Old Testament, from Isaiah, and he uses a Septuagint translation. And the translation says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son." And the Septuagint uses the word Parthenos. But if you look at the original Hebrew, the word that's used is Alma, which means young woman. Parthenos is a Greek for virgin. So whoever translated the Septuagint translated young woman as virgin. And therefore, when Matthew is arguably going through the Old Testament and trawling through for prophecies to validate his claims, he finds this one and then arguably creates a virgin birth account out of a prophecy that is actually a mistranslation. And really, in Hebrew, if they wanted to use virgin, they would use the word Bethulah. But these prophecies are problematic anyway, because if you carry on reading it, it can't be applied to Jesus in any way. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough. He knows enough to refuse evil and choose good, for before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose kings you dread, blah, 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 blah. And the rest of it doesn't apply at all to Jesus. So you'll find that Matthew and Luke both take out these so-called prophecies, and that's why I'll call them so-called prophecies. They are verses that apply to a completely different context, and they will cherry pick, they will quote mine just a little bit that they will then apply to Jesus. But I think that technique is pretty dodgy at best. So the next problem, the male genome. Christ is supposed to be fully man and fully God. This is an essential Christian doctrine. But to be fully man, really, you've got to have the full genome of the male as well as the female in order to integrate and create the genome of the offspring. But if God is essentially selecting the male genome because it's a miraculous birth and Joseph wasn't the father, then where does this fully human DNA come from? If it's selected by God and Jesus ends up being pretty much perfect and so on and so forth, then it's hard to say that Jesus really was fully man. On what basis was the genome and therefore the personality of Jesus decided? Being decided by God, I do think invalidates the fully man thesis. And it also shows that the ancient Jews didn't really understand the birds and the bees, because this is a bit of a problem. Next problem, genealogies. And when I talked about Luke 1 and 2 being later interpolations, it's quite interesting. Some of the evidence for that is that the Greek in Luke 1 and 2 is Hebraic, Semitic, very refined literary Greek. And then when you hit Luke 3, it becomes Koine Greek, more common. The theology changes. So the way it's written, the content is very different. But also, Luke 3 starts with, and in the 15th year, blah, 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 and a genealogy, which looks very much like the start of a gospel. But it starts at chapter 3. So this is more evidence that Luke 1 and 2 were tacked on. There's quite a lot of really good evidence to show that Luke 1 and 2 were interpolations. But he has a genealogy there, and Matthew has a genealogy, and they're completely different. Even when you equate for when they start at the same place. So Luke goes all the way back to Adam, I think. Matthew doesn't. But when you take them from Abraham, Luke has far more names, and the names are different. So why is this? They can't even agree on the father of Joseph. It looks like they use independent sources to find two completely different genealogies. It looks like numerology is very important, groups of 7 or groups of 14. So it's a very symbolic way of doing it. They get certain names are definitely missed off that we know were fit between certain people, and Jeconiah's in one of them, and we know that his offspring were cursed, which means Jesus would be cursed, which is a real problem. Yada, 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 yada. There are problems with the genealogies. The extent that Christians go through to harmonize these, one of the and again, this goes back to possibilita ergo probabilita. It's possible, therefore it's what happened, is that actually Luke uses the matrilineal genealogy of Jesus, which is to say it goes through the mother's side, except it doesn't. There's no evidence for this, and literally no Jewish genealogy in the history of Judaism has ever done this. So in order to say this is what explains the differences, you have to say this and only this genealogy does this in the history of Judaism. And that's incredibly improbable. So the genealogies are a problem. As I've said, where did they live? Luke had them living in Nazareth to begin with and going down to Bethlehem, and he uses a census to get them to Bethlehem. Matthew has them already living in Bethlehem. So here we have another contradiction. And this comes out of, as I said, a misinterpreted prophecy, which says, but as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah. So this can also be translated Bethlehem, house of Ephrathah. So what this means is that it isn't the place of Bethlehem that the Messiah has to be born, but the Messiah has to be born in the lineage of David, who came from Bethlehem. So you wouldn't be talking, so when you say, but as for you, Bethlehem, you wouldn't be talking to a town. You wouldn't be saying you, Bethlehem. This is talking of the lineage of David, okay? And so Again, Matthew and Luke are taking something out of the Old Testament and misusing it. In this case, to make sure that Jesus is born in Bethlehem so that it fulfills a prophecy. But he didn't need to be born in Bethlehem, could have been born in Nazareth. And this means he just needs to be of the lineage of David. So those genealogies should do the job alone. Luke, as I said, uses a census. Matthew has them living there already. Jesus is known as Jesus of Bethlehem. We don't hear, not known as Jesus of Bethlehem. He's known as Jesus of Nazareth. We never hear Bethlehem mentioned again in Luke and Matthew, and we don't hear Bethlehem mentioned in Paul, Mark, or John. So Bethlehem is an anomaly apart from in these infancy narratives of Luke and Matthew. And it's a long way from Bethlehem to Nazareth. And then there's an important difference in geography that we will talk about. Now, this is, I think, the single biggest issue. Matthew has Herod being alive, killing babies and chasing Jesus off into Egypt. Luke has a census that was done under Quirinius. We know that Herod died in 4 or 5 BCE. We know that the census of Quirinius took place in 6 CE. Herod died 10 years before that census. And you can bet that Herod didn't chase Jesus off just as he was going to die. It's going to be a 2-year time frame probably before that. So because we know that he killed babies up to the age of 2. And then Jesus was living in, he was in Egypt until it was safe to come back. So you can bet that this is probably a 12-year gap. This is an outright contradiction. So what Christians try and do is they all sorts of ways of solving this, and I deal with this a lot in my book. It takes up a large section of the book because so much ink has been spilled on this issue. People will try and pick apart the date that census is dated, but they can't, because what happened is we know that Herod died in 4 or 5 BCE, and they'll try and pick apart that date, but that date is based on Josephus, who's a very good historian for dates and aspects of Herod's life. If you say that he didn't die in 4 or 5 BC, all the other dates fall apart, and everything we know about that time falls apart. But it's not just Josephus, a Jewish historian. It's Cassius Dio, a Roman historian that we know didn't use Josephus as a source, and coinage that has a Roman governor called Varus, who we know was ruling when Herod died, and we know that those coins disappeared in 4 BCE. So Varus was not around after 4 BCE. So Herod has to have died before 4 BCE. So Herod definitely died in 4 BCE. Luke definitely has this census under Quirinius, and that happened in 6 because when Herod the Great died, his son Herod Archelaus ruled as tetrarch of Judea for 10 years. He did such a bad job that the Romans came along. And at the time, this was what's called a client kingdom. It was a buffer zone at the edge of the Roman Empire that was semi-autonomous. So Herod the Great could do what he liked, pretty much. He just had to pay a little bit of money to Rome every year. But he was an autonomous ruler by most regards. Herod Archelaus, his son, took over. He did such a bad job that the Romans came back and said, no, you're rubbish. We're going to take this area back, and it's going to be a Roman province. But in order for it to become a Roman province, we need to know who lives there. So they ran a census in Judea because Quirinius became governor then, and it became a Roman province. So we are well, I would say Christians will contest this, but I'm absolutely certain that these are the dates. And there is a huge amount of evidence to support both dates. And this leaves at least a 12-year gap where either Luke is wrong or Matthew is wrong. They both cannot have happened at the same time. Herod could not be alive at the time of the census of Quirinius. So there are so many defenses that Christians use, that Quirinius ruled twice. In fact, I was arguing with a vicar last night for 6 hours, who was doing exactly this. And he said that that Quirinius ruled in 6 CE, but he also ruled earlier with Varus. So he was a co-governor with Varus and ruled twice. But there is no there's no evidence in the history of the Roman Empire of a co-governorship of any province. So literally, there's no such thing as a co-governorship. There's also no evidence of a governor ruling twice in the same province. Literally no evidence anywhere. Plus, we know that Varus ruled. He was on the coins, not Quirinius. Plus, Quirinius was never mentioned by Josephus doing the history of Herod. Plus, all of this positive evidence that we have from Roman historians, we know he couldn't have ruled twice. As I've told you, you know, they will say that Josephus is wrong, but we know Josephus is accurate with dates, and we know that if you pull that date apart, literally all the other history falls apart as well. So to do this, you've really got to push the boat out on what you think is possible, and it's certainly not plausible. We're back to the possibiliter ergo probabiliter. It's possible, therefore it's what happened. But if you can find no other example in the history of the Roman Empire, it's a real issue. But more than this, as I mentioned, under Herod the Great, it was a client kingdom where it was an autonomous area of rulership by Herod the Great. And as a client kingdom, no client kingdom in the history of the Roman Empire has ever had a tax census for the Roman Empire. So because they didn't need to, the Roman Empire wasn't running it. The Romans they haven't had a census in the client kingdoms anywhere, right? In the Roman Empire in history. So under Herod, they simply wouldn't have had a census at all. But it's actually worse than that, because Judea, which is where Herod Archelaus was ruling and then was taken over by the Romans, was in a different tax area than Galilee, which is where Nazareth was. So if you were having really were having a tax census, you would never go from one tax area to another tax area to do your census. It's like going from Chichester up to Scotland to do your tax census, because it was pragmatically required by the Romans. For what reason? I don't know. So basically, there wouldn't have been a tax census at all, because it was a client kingdom, and Galilee and Judea were different tax regions. Which takes me on to the nonsense that is Luke's census. Luke's census happened we assume, if we were to believe Luke, in 6 CE. It was a tax census that we know that Quirinius did because it became a Roman province. Okay, fair enough. But this is what Luke says about the census. And everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, it's actually down, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. There is so much issue in that short passage that it's phenomenal. First of all, Joseph, as according to the genealogy of Luke, is 41 generations removed from David. So remember, he went to Bethlehem because it was the city of David. The question is, why would you go to an ancestral town for a census? Imagine I said to Dodie now, I said, Dodie, you're Sussex, aren't you? Well, England, the English census, the ONS, Office of National Statistics, has demanded that we all do a census. That's fine. Okay. But Dodie, you need to go to the place that your ancestor 41 generations previously lived. Would you know, Dodie, yes or no, where your ancestors from 41 generations before lived? Yes or no? Yes, you've got ancestry.com, and that's a cheat. So she's nodding her head there. But in all honesty, in all seriousness, ancient Jews, although genealogies were important, the fact is no one, or not everyone, is going to know their ancestors from 41 generations past. But also, more importantly, why would you be going to a census to an ancestral town? What would be the reason? There is no example of this type of census in the history of humanity. Literally no census has required in human history for people to go back to the town of their ancestors. If you actually ask apologists, okay, I believe you, but why would this be asked? There's no pragmatic answer. I've never heard one answer given for why this would be a good idea. Why 41 generations? Why not 2? Why not 10? Why not 5? Why not 100? 40, or can you just choose? Can you just choose what? In that case, a bit like all US presidents can be linked to King Charlemagne, everyone can link themselves to King David. The whole world, the whole of Judea would be going to Bethlehem. No wonder there's no room at the inn, because quite frankly, everyone's gone there because everyone's linked themselves to David. And, you know, there's a prophecy that yada, yada, yada. It's just absolutely insane. Who would know their family tree that far back? Given all the siblings and the sheer volume of descendants, everyone in Israel could connect themselves to David, or would be at least getting up and going to a different place. So the population would just get up and move for about a month. This would take at least a month to sort out. This would be economic suicide. Okay, who would be tending the fields? Who would be working in the inns? Who would be looking after the slaves? So on and so forth. And this is for the Romans to do a tax census. If you're trying to work out how much an area is worth, you want people in that area to be there to tell you that that area is worth that much. Censors go to the towns. Roman censors would go to a town to do a census. You wouldn't get up and go to a censor. That's not how it worked like that. So it's just a really bizarre interpretation of what a census does. And that's because Luke really needs to get Jesus from Nazareth to Bethlehem. That's his job. And this is his vehicle. And as I said, Galilee is also in a different tax area. So even if there was some requirement to move, he would be needing to be fulfilling his census requirements in Galilee and Judea. In fact, I'm not even sure that Galilee had the census. It was only Judea. So it's just, there are so many problems to that very short passage, and those problems don't finish there. Joseph wouldn't have been working. How is he? And if you believe Matthew, he goes to Egypt for a couple of years. How is a carpenter getting by? How does anyone get by upping sticks and going away for maybe 3 weeks? This is, as I said, economic suicide. But it gets worse because women weren't required at a census. Now, I don't know, Dodie, you've told me that you have a child. Is that right? Yeah. So okay, you got okay. So you got 3 children, right? So I just would like to. Is that your husband next to you, Dodie? Yes. So husband of Dodie, would you have asked Dodie when she was 9 months pregnant to get on a donkey and go for an 80-mile, 5-day donkey trip through bandit country to a census that she was not required to go to? I don't think so. I'm going to answer for you, because I know when I asked my partner just to go to the fridge to get some milk when she was 9 months pregnant, that I was for the high jump, right? So getting on a donkey, going 80 miles through bandit country to a census that she would not have been required to. She almost certainly would have had a roadside birth. And it's just absolute nonsense. Now, some Christians claim that, well, it's because if she'd stayed there, she would have been stoned to death for having a child out of wedlock. But the issue with this is that by her going down to the census and then coming back, she still had a child out of wedlock, and she would still be able to be stoned for that supposed crime. So it's not a very good get out of jail free card. I mean, personally, I think she should have gone to Elizabeth, who also had a miraculous birth, and gone and stayed with her, because she'd already sort of met her previously in Luke's gospel. But, you know, it's just another reason why the census never happened. Now, let's move across to Matthew. Problems 13 and 14 here. The Magi randomly go to Jerusalem for no particular reason, given that the star, this miraculous, it has to be a supernatural star. You cannot follow a star, a tiny twinkling dot up in the sky. You cannot follow, especially when the earth is rotating around the sun. So the sky is sort of, you'd just be walking in very big circles. The star, in my opinion, has to be supernatural. At the end of the day, it indicates a single house. No star can do that. So they're following the supernatural star. They appear to lose it in Jerusalem, which is a dogleg down to Bethlehem from the east. Why? Well, it seems that that Matthew really wants to get Herod involved in the story. So these magi are a mechanism to get Herod involved. It looks like the story of the Magi are copied from Daniel and his Magi, and a story of Balaam and Balak, which is another story from the Old Testament involving the original Magi, Balaam. I won't bore you about all the details of that, but it's worth looking into. It just looks like Matthew is taking these stories, reworking them into the Jesus story to give it a stamp of validation, because his audience were Jews. So he's really keen on getting a Jewish validation. And from that Balaam story, you get a scepter shall rise from Israel, referring, both to Jesus and the star itself, arguably. So that's the sort of thing that Matthew did. Now, I'm not going to go through any of those, but those are the similarities between the Balaam and Balak story and the Jesus and Herod story and the Magi story. There are similarities between all of these stories. So it looks like Jesus is a retelling and the Magi is a retelling. So let's have a little think about Herod now. Let's move on to problem 15. Herod has these Magi shout about the Messiah. He gets his scribes to find out a prophecy that he doesn't appear to know about, which is odd, since it shows that Jesus, the new Messiah, is going to be born just down the road. You would think everyone would be moving to Bethlehem to have their kid, right, in the hope that there'd be a Messiah. But anyway, so what Herod says to these guys, you know what, I'm going to trust you. You're going to go down, praise Jesus, and then come back to me and tell me where they are. We know that Herod's not a very nice guy. In real life, history tells us he did some pretty horrible stuff. He was also very ill at the time, over 70, and had even tried committing suicide. He wasn't very interested in the future of his lands, which is why he left the client kingdom in such a state that Herod Archelaus took over, and it was a state for 10 years, and then it got taken over by the Romans again. Herod wasn't interested in the future. So why would he be interested in this Messiah child who would come to fruition in 20 years' time when he would be long dead by then? It's very bizarre. But anyway, he trusts the Magi to come back to him. They don't, but luckily he asks them where the star is in the sky and triangulates that it must mean that Bethlehem's a general area. So he goes and kills those children. Now, this is just a very bizarre thing to do, because he should have accompanied them or sent a military escort with the Magi. That is what the sort of thing we would expect Herod to have done. For him to trust them is very bizarre and only looks like a way of Matthew being able to get Jesus surviving and Herod killing children. Why does Matthew want Herod killing children? We will talk about that in a second. Let's just go back to the star before we talk about that. The Star of Bethlehem was not a real star. There are so many reasons why it's not a real star. I edited a book by Dr. Aaron Adair called The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical Inquiry, that looks at the Star of Bethlehem, and it's a real go-to book on whether it's a supernatural or a natural phenomenon. But the most important thing to remember here is it's not attested to by anyone in the world. So you've got this incredible star leading the Magi, who really super important wise men from the east, to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and no one else in the world has seen it, or it's not attested to anywhere. This is a very astrologically and astronomically astute society or set of cultures around there, and no one reports this at all. What's the most plausible explanation? That this happened, or that this is made up by Matthew? You've also got a very interesting story that Matthew wrote in about 85 CE, right? And in 66 CE, the Halley's Comet came over. And we know for a fact that King Tiridates from Armenia took a bunch of actual Magi and followed, or didn't follow the comet, but used the comet as an omen to go to all the way from the east to the Emperor Nero in Rome, worship the Emperor Nero, and then crucially go back home a different way. So there is an interesting theory that Matthew took that story and incorporated it into his account in the infancy narrative, an actual historical event of Magi coming from the east to worship a so-called savior, the Roman emperor. And actually, you know, I mentioned that Jesus has to compete with Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was known as Divi Filius, which is the Son of God, which is what Jesus was known as. He was also known as the Savior of the world, which is what Jesus was known as. So, you know, Jesus had to really compete with these emperors on many levels. So why did Matthew really want Herod in on the action? Well, the reason is because Matthew wants Jesus to be the new Moses. Why? Because Moses is one of the most important. He was the author, supposedly, of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. Moses is your key Old Testament Jewish guy. If Matthew is going to convince his Jewish audience that Jesus is the man, Jesus needs to be the new Moses. How does he get Jesus being the new Moses? Jesus is chased out of Egypt into Egypt by Herod, who is the new Pharaoh. Herod kills the children, which is the Pharaoh killing the firstborn. This is a retelling of the Passover. And so Jesus survives this kind of Passover incident, goes to Egypt, comes out of Egypt to fulfill a prophecy. He, as Moses did, he comes out of Egypt like Moses did to reclaim the promised land. It's, to me, this is, I mean, I think that actually I'm quite in awe of the gospel writers for the way that they interweave the Old Testament in with the New Testament claims, particularly in the infancy narratives. And I think if I was a Jew at the time, this would tick loads of boxes for me, and I'd be thinking, yes, Jesus, awesome, he's the new Moses, so on and so forth. And so this whole thing happens, I think, as a literary technique mechanism to get Herod involved, and it presents a massive problem. And here's the problem: the Magi get a dream sequence to warn them not to go back to Jerusalem whilst they are in Bethlehem. What happens is this causes Herod to come down and kill a bunch of innocent children in trying to get Jesus. What God should have done is have the dream sequence happen to the Magi just before they got to Jerusalem in the first place. Give them a warning not to go to Jerusalem and tell them to go straight to Bethlehem. The Magi go straight to Bethlehem. Herod knows nothing. No innocent children are killed. The placement of the dream sequence is philosophically thoroughly problematic because it means Jesus being born and the Magi getting not getting that dream sequence earlier are causally responsible for the death of innocent children. And this is a problem. Some people have pointed out that Jesus is causally responsible for the death of innocent children. And this is theologically very problematic. But it could easily have been avoided if the dream sequence happened just before the Magi got to Jerusalem. Doesn't happen because obviously this is made up, and Matthew wasn't thinking in these terms, and he really wanted the slaughter of the innocents to happen because this was the slaughter of the firstborn, because Herod is a new Pharaoh. Anyway, it's all very odd, and what's particularly odd is the Magi and the shepherds, who are both, you know, perfect evangelists, disappear forever and then never heard from again. Absolutely disappear off the face of the earth. So the slaughter of the innocents is not attested to anywhere. We know so much about Herod, and this incident is never mentioned. As I've already said, he was unlikely to have done it anyway because he was very close to death and wouldn't be bothered about a future king in 20 years' time coming to take over his throne. He left the kingdom in turmoil, so on and so forth. So this is just, I think, just a simple retelling of the killing of the firstborn. The shepherds, why? So we've got only 2 points left and then I'm done. So the problem 19, the shepherds versus the Magi, these are chosen very carefully. Nothing happens. I think the construction of the infancy narratives are so attuned to the theology of both Luke and Matthew. And this is particularly evident in who they choose to praise Jesus. We know that Luke was very interested in Greco-Roman literature. His Greek was very good. His knowledge of Greek literature appears to be pretty sound, or one would imagine would be very sound. Shepherds were very humble, important sort of people within Greco-Roman literature. It also shows that Jesus appeals to poor people, the meek. And also David was a shepherd. Jesus is from the Davidic stock. Bethlehem is David's city. So there's lots of reasons why shepherds were chosen. Never heard from again, but there you go. Matthew, on the other hand, is not appealing to Gentiles like Luke is. Gentiles are non-Jewish people. Matthew is appealing to Jewish people. So he's going to be using things that are really important to Jewish people. He chooses Magi, the rich, influential Gentiles, which is to say, this is Judaism and Christianity overcoming Gentiles. We are more important. We are better than Gentile belief systems. In this case, they are Zoroastrians from the East, a competitor, if you like, in the marketplace of ideas and religions. So these guys are Zoroastrians coming from the East who effectively will be converting and finding this new God figure. But again, they go back and they're never heard from again. But this would really appeal to the Jewish audience. So they have completely different people. The shepherds are not mentioned in Matthew, and the Magi are not mentioned at all in Luke. These are real problematic, missing parts of the jigsaw to each of the Gospels. Finally, as I've mentioned, the flight to Egypt is a retelling of the Moses story. And this is an example of how Matthew couches many of the claims. And actually, this happens in a resurrection as well with the gospel authors. This time, this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. So this whole thing happens in order for that one line to just be ticked off. Yes, he comes out of Egypt, therefore he's a Messiah, therefore he's a new Moses. The problem is Luke has very explicitly Joseph and Mary going straight back to Nazareth after Jesus is born. He says, when the 32 days of purification were over, Joseph and Mary took Jesus to the temple to be circumcised. When that was over, they returned to Nazareth. If I told you, Maureen, I'm going to use you again. If I told you, when I finish cooking, I'm going to go to the shops, I hope this wouldn't allow Maureen to think that I could maybe run off to Egypt for 2 years between doing the cooking and going to the shops. So when I finish the cooking, I am going to go shopping. These two things are causally and temporally connected. You cannot have something thrown in the middle that it lasts 2 years. So when Christians say, well, Luke doesn't say it didn't happen, as Matthew said, he kind of does, because he said when the birth was over, they went to the temple, and when that was over, they went back to Nazareth. Matthew says when the birth was over, Herod chased them away to Egypt, and after some time when Herod had died, they came back and didn't go back to Bethlehem because it was still too dangerous, and moved for the first time to Nazareth. That is a huge contradiction. And here endeth the lesson. There are far more contradictions and issues within these two infancy narratives. Where does this leave the Christian? Well, if I was a Christian, well, actually, I will refer you back to someone called Raymond Brown. Raymond Brown was, I think, the greatest biblical exegete in the history of biblical exegesis, which is the study and the interpretation of the Bible. Raymond Brown was a Catholic, Father Raymond Brown, and he wrote The Birth of the Messiah and a 2-part volume, The Death of the Messiah. The Birth of the Messiah is probably the most magisterial analysis of the infancy narratives. He, as a committed Christian, said these are historically thoroughly problematic. And what he says is almost, this is history dramatized. He said that there is a theological verisimilitude. But my point is that I really admire what you've done, and there's some good, honest scholarship going on there, and you do find these really problematic. But where are you getting your theological verisimilitude? Where are you getting your theological truth? Imagine your theology is like a coat, right? And you're wearing it and you come back and you need to hang your theology coat on something. So what you do is you hang it on these hooks that are historical hooks. And these historical hooks are nailed into the, are screwed into the wall very securely, hopefully, so that you can hang your theology on something. What I'm doing here is I'm taking out these hooks and saying, well, that bit of history didn't work, that bit of history didn't work, that bit of history didn't work, and that didn't happen. So what is Raymond Brown, for example, hanging his theology coat on? He's going to put it there and it will fall down. The theology, if it has no history on which to be founded, on which to have a foundation, then it just falls down. There is no theology. The theology is like a castle in the air without foundation. It's just a bare assertion. You can't tell me that Jesus is a Messiah if all the historical pointers to his messianic qualities are false. On what are you basing his messianic qualities then? And if I'm finding that all these historical issues are problematic and are disconfirmed, then what does this say? As I said at the beginning, what does this say about all the miracle claims in the middle of the Gospels, which have no intersection with history? So there you go. That's my talk. Sorry, I spoke probably very quickly and at breakneck speed. I've written a bunch of books on these sorts of topics and other things to do with religion or the lack of religion, and I hope you got something out of that.
So Joseph, coming from the family of David,
yes,
if they believed all that, but then on the other hand they're saying Joseph wasn't the father of Jesus, then those two things don't work out anyway.
Yes, that's a very good point. A very, very almost simple point, isn't it? The fact that Jesus wasn't born of Joseph, and therefore having the genealogies at all is a moot point. Is pointless. This is either, I mean, this might speak of not understanding bloodlines and not really understanding how genetics and genealogies work in a kind of biological way, or it's just a glaring problem. I absolutely agree, Dodie, and it's something, again, I think I mentioned in my book, it's another glaring problem. It's amazing that these two relatively short narratives have so many problems. Literally every single verse or section just throws up one problem after another. But yeah, I agree that genealogy is almost invalidated by the point of fact that he doesn't have a blood father.
Okay.
Any other questions at all?
Who first called Herod the Great?
Goodness me. Well, knowing him, probably himself. I'm not too sure about that. He had 3 children, all called Herod. So, that probably tells you something about him. I think he had lots of children, but there were 3. Herod Archelaus was the tetrarch of Judea. Herod Antipas was the ruler up in Galilee. So when Joseph and Mary decided to move back to Nazareth, it would have been Herod Antipas, who was, I believe, doing a slightly better job than Herod Archelaus was in the Judean area. But Herod was a nasty piece of work, and the murder of the innocents was something he would have done, but the fact that it's not attested to anywhere in history is problematic. Now, quite often you hear this maxim: the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And what this means is, just because you don't hear about it somewhere doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's true. That's fairly plausible and works quite often. Where it goes wrong is when you absolutely expect something to be attested to. When you expect, I've got an article on my blog exactly on this, which pulls on an article written by a mathematician who goes into this in more detail. But when you fully expect something to be attested to, and it's not. For example, if I said to you, "Oh, do you know what? In Chichester yesterday, there was a massive earthquake that was like 7.5 on a Richter, 6.5 on a Richter scale," and I told you that, the fact that you had not heard that anywhere in any news source, media source, online, social media, is evidence that it didn't happen, because you would absolutely expect it to happen. So in that case, I would argue there are times when absence of evidence is evidence of absence. In the case of all these things happening here, if none of them are attested to, like anywhere, in the way that we would expect, in isolation, maybe, yeah, that's not too big a deal. But if we're having a lack of attestation right across the board, this starts becoming a bit of a problem. And something like the murder of the innocents, when Josephus clocks a load of Herod's atrocities, and we don't have that one. We're not sure how many innocents, how many children died. Some Christians will only say like a dozen babies. Some will say like 50, 100, whatever. But it's not attested to at all. I do think that's a problem. Does anyone else have any nativity themed questions? Yes, Mark.
I was just interested. Did I hear you right that all of the Gospels as we have them were originally written down in the Greek? Or are they, because aren't there these ones from Nag Hammadi and things like that, where they have earlier versions that were written down in Aramaic?
I'd have to. Do you know what? 10 years ago, I would have answered that. I would have to look into that. As far as I know, the earliest sources are Greek. The earliest, so the earliest fragments that we have, I think it was P52. So we have I think it's
the tiny little pieces.
The tiny bit from John is the earliest, and that's in Greek, and so the earliest extant versions, you then have to go to, I think, 400 odd to get a full gospel. And so when you start finding other things, they won't be the earliest versions. I think the Greek versions are, in any case, the earliest versions thereof. And yeah, as far as I'm aware, the Gospels weren't at all written in Aramaic. And which brings me on to another interesting thing. It's not so pertinent for the Nativity. I'd say it's pertinent right across the board for the Gospels, but particularly in, say, the Resurrection, where you've got Pontius Pilate having a private conversation with Jesus. When you start getting so-called history books, these aren't history books, these are evangelists' manuals. But if Christians are saying, well, these are history books, these are doing history, then how are you getting private conversations being recounted? Who's standing there with a dictaphone? How accurate is a private conversation? How are we recording what was said? If it's private, who was there? So if it's between Jesus and Pontius Pilate, who's recording that conversation? And how does it end up being in the gospel? And how do we know it's accurate? So I think there are lots of, when you're talking about like Aramaic being the language, and then you're saying, well, it's being written in Greek, there are problems with how that happens, but also problems with how do you generate accurate histories at all, especially when you're using no recognized historiography. So again, if you're not at all talking about your sources, so no single history book in the history of books, or no book is 100% accurate. Even modern history books, the author writing them is going to be saying, this is my best guess at how this happened. It's certainly not going to be 100% indubitably correct. But Christians approach the Gospels as if they are 100% correct. You're not going to get that through a naturalistic analysis of the historical techniques used. You can only get that by saying it's the inspired word of God and it's a miracle that it's correct, in which case you can say anything, So I think when you try and call these books history books, it's a problem. When you're saying that what people often say is Luke is a brilliant historian, and what they really mean is Luke mentions a load of places that actually exist and a load of people who actually exist. Well, Arthur Conan Doyle did that with Sherlock Holmes. Set in the context of Victorian Britain, he's going to mention places and people who existed at the time. That doesn't mean he's doing history. These guys aren't doing history. Just because Luke mentions a couple of things that are verifiable doesn't mean that his claims about Jesus are verifiable. I think lots of problems. Anyway, that's just lots of different topics and ideas. But yeah, good point. I'm pretty sure none of them were originally in Aramaic.
Thank you.
Any other questions about anything Jesus-y or Nativity or Bible?
Oh, where do we start?
Well, yeah, there you go. I mean, yeah, one of the analogies I often use is imagine in 30 years' time that I write an account of the life of David Koresh, but in 30 years' time, before I write that, I decide David Koresh is amazing. He's a Messiah, right? So I convert to being a Koreshian, right? David Koresh is a Messiah, but I haven't met him myself, and I've not met any of his contemporaries or eyewitnesses of David Koresh. I also don't have the internet, don't have a telephone, don't have access to public libraries in the way that we do today. I don't have public transport. I can't verify my own research particularly easily at all, if not at all. And my audience can't verify my claims. And I come to write ex post facto, after the fact, after believing David Koresh is a Messiah, I write an account of his life. 2,000 years goes on. Someone comes back, finds that book. Is that book where I am setting out to convince the audience of believing what I believe? Is that book the most historically, objectively accurate account of the life of David Koresh? And no one in their right mind should say, yes, that's going to be a really accurate account of the life of David Koresh. No one should admit that. So if you can't admit that, then you should never start trying to claim that the gospel accounts of Jesus are, or even can be, accurate accounts of Jesus' life. And I think once you understand the provenance of the gospels and that are written, 50 years after he was born to 110 years after he was born, then you're admitting and relying, they're not independent, they're relying on each other. So Mark started, it was embellished by Matthew and Luke, possibly using Q as well, but embellished by Matthew and Luke. And then John oversees them all and changes their theology hugely, right? And so embellishes it even more, but adds on a whole massive layer of what's called Christology, this idea that Jesus was actually God, which actually the first three gospel writers didn't really believe. I think they thought he was a Messiah. I always want to say, but a very naughty boy. He's not a Messiah, but they believed he was a Messiah, but not necessarily God, because I don't think the Holy Trinity had been developed yet as an idea, right? So they're embellishing all from Mark. So who is Mark using? These aren't independent sources. These aren't four accounts giving four different independent attestations to Jesus's life. These are four accounts being broadly based on one account. So the question is, what do we do with that information? Well, as a critical scholar or doing critical analysis, you can say, well, this means it's even less reliable than four independent sources.
Isn't it interesting, though, that having spent all this trouble creating stories like the Nativity, which make very, very clear routing to those who have a great foundation in Jewish history and Jewish resonance, to then have, like, from Acts onwards, Paul coming along and being Alistair Campbell and saying, oh, okay, we're New Labour, so we're not actually going to make any reference to Judaism now. We're going to sort of sell it to the whole world and completely change the whole basis of what the first four books were setting about doing.
But that's exactly what you would expect. So if you're going to say, right, as a fiction writer, Mark, you're going to write a fictional religion being created in, I don't know, 500 CE, right? And you start from scratch, you invent the whole thing. you would say, well, this is going to be a political sort of thing. There's going to be factions, aren't there? There are going to be people disagreeing. They're going to be disagreeing on what the theology should be, what the rituals should be. And that's exactly what happens, right? So you have Peter and Paul and James and factions developing in the early church. And arguably Paul stamps his authority, wins the debate, and Christianity is in fact Paultianity.
Somewhat helped by the fact that Rome destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70.
70, yeah. And so using the whole Roman Empire, it could then disseminate across a large area relatively quickly. And there's very interesting theories about how it developed so quickly and whatnot. But it's exactly what you'd expect, which is people vying for authority, trying to stamp their authority. Again, you could say, look, if I want my version of what I think happened with Jesus to be believed by my audience the most, then I need to, when you teach English, I've taught English, right? You do audience, purpose, task, right? This is how, when you're teaching 10-year-olds, 20-year-olds, how to do writing, 50-year-olds, how to do writing, you go audience, purpose, task. Who's your audience? What's the purpose you're writing? And what's your task you want to do? So when you're Matthew, you're thinking, right, my audience is Jews. My purpose is to convince them to believe in Jesus. And my task is writing this gospel and an account of Jesus's life. Those three will dictate the language I use and how I do it. So just like I'm writing a persuasive advert in a newspaper or a leaflet that comes through your door, they are going to be thinking, who are my audience? How am I going to write this? And what's best going to achieve my objectives. So for Matthew, it's going to be like, my Jewish audience are going to absolutely love Jesus to be the new Moses. So I've got to talk about Herod being the Pharaoh. I've got to talk about Balaam, Balak. That's really important. I've got to use loads of prophecies from the Old Testament that I'm just going to throw liberally around and develop my Jesus story around that. And I'm going to just pull on all of these motifs and themes. And once he does that, his Jewish audience read it and go, awesome. Yeah, I get this. I'm a Jew and this really appeals to me. Luke has a different audience. Gentiles, they're going to be, he's writing in sort of much more refined Greek maybe, and pulling on more Gentile themes to appeal to that audience, so on and so forth. So the way that these things get constructed depend largely on what the theology of the people writing them was and what they wanted to achieve.
You've done so much work in looking into all this.
Yeah, well, I suppose. I mean,
what was your motivation to dig so deeply?
Well, it's a really interesting question. That so, what happened is a decade ago or so, I started going to. I was teaching at the time, and I started going to something we called the Tippling Philosophers, which is why my blog name is A Tippling Philosopher.
Oh yes,
which was a group of people that met once a month to discuss all things philosophical and theological. And there were the guy who started it was then a committed conservative Christian, and I wasn't. So we used to argue, and then this got bigger and bigger, and I had to do more research to defend my position. And then you start thinking, well, am I post hoc rationalizing? Am I looking for stuff to support my position? Is he doing that? How's it? Oh, I need to work out how I do my philosophy, my epistemology, how I go and work out what I know and how I know it. And then when you start looking into one area, and particularly in philosophy, you realize I need to know about this area because that influences that. But to know about this area, I need to know about this area because that influences that. And in the end, you're like, I've got to really do some reevaluation of everything. So I did a master's in philosophy and started writing books on philosophy and stuff, and what I wanted was to build what you find with some people, and these are atheists and Christians and Muslims alike, is they build up a wall of belief, but they'll have a brick missing here and a brick missing there and a brick missing there. For me, it's really important to build up, or they have no bricks at all here and everything's built up here with no foundation. So they start with a Bible and they build backwards. I want to do bottom up building. So I think, what are abstract objects made of? What are concepts made of? Because if we're talking about morality and love and loyalty, if we don't know what these abstract ideas are made of, then how can we argue about whether they exist or not? Are they just concepts in our mind, or do they exist out there in some kind of ether, right? So forget about arguing about whether God exists. We need to know what abstract objects are. That's your early bricks in your wall. And then you've got to argue this and that and that and that. So I've been building my wall up over the years, and I am absolutely certain, I don't want to be dogmatic here, but I'm just really confident that my wall has no holes in. I can go to sleep at night and actually feel there's nothing that is insecure and dodgy, and I haven't fudged any brick. I haven't just put in some putty here that's going to crumble away after a couple of years. That all my bricks are really solid. The only thing that makes me go, "Whoo," is, and this would apply to a Christian or a theist as much as an atheist, is why is there something rather than nothing? That's the only thing where I go, "Ooh." But you could apply that to God. You know, even if I believed in God, why is there something? Why is there God rather than nothing? Literally philosophical nothingness. And that's the only thing that makes me go, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think I can answer it. Life is just a brute fact. Matter is just a brute fact. It's necessary in the same way that theists argue that God is necessary. I would say that matter is necessary. This universe is somehow necessary. It's just a brute fact of existence. Other than that, I'm really happy with my wall. But you're right, you do have to know about an awful lot of stuff. So when you're arguing about the philosophy of religion, you need to know about the psychology of religion. You need to know why people are believing things, not what they believe and what they should believe, but why they do believe bonkers things. So when you want to start unpicking why religious people believe things, you need to know about the psychology of religion, why they feel like they need to believe things. Because if I'm going to convince you to believe in the truth, because I am essentially searching for the truth myself, then I need to understand why you believe these things in order to unpick that. And it's a bit like saying we live in a post-God world now, I think, where the God argument is been and done and been and had and is over. God doesn't exist. But what God does exist in people's minds. So God is functional. So if God plays a functional part in people's lives, and you're saying God's not true, then they have a problem not believing that, because God does a function for them. So if you're taking that away from them, they still need to fulfill those desires or needs or functions that God provides. So if you're saying God underwrites your morality, so if I say God doesn't exist, I need to provide something to underwrite your morality. God, you attribute explanation to God. Things you don't understand, God. So if I take God away from you, I need to say it's okay for you to not know things. It's okay for you to say, I don't know, but here are the ways I can find out. Or I'm just comfortable with saying I don't know. If God does this for you, if God provides security for you in death, that's a tough one for atheism, right? So you have the ultimate carrot and stick. If you believe in God, you're going to go to heaven. That's nothing greater in human conception than that. If you don't believe, you're going to go to hell. Nothing worse in human conception. You don't get a bigger carrot and stick. Atheists go, if you don't believe in God, it doesn't matter. And when you die, you become worm food. So when you try and convince a Christian out of that, and this is called terror management theory. There's this thing called mortality salience, where you're saying the reason why I can't convince a creationist out of their bonkers idea that the world is 6,000 years old is because if I do that, what I'm doing is taking away their afterlife and their eternal life in paradise. So it's not so easy as saying the world is obviously not 6,000 years old and here's the evidence. Because if I do that to them, I'm taking away their eternal life in heaven. So therefore, I need to understand that God does more than is just an abstract idea. God is a functional thing for them that I need to unpick or at least supplant with something else if I hope to truly convince someone towards a greater idea of truth of the universe. Does that make sense?
Are you asking me? Or
Yeah, well, anyone really. Is anyone listening?
I mean, I suppose having sort of come up through the atheist way, I something you said towards the beginning where I feel that and I like that the idea that you're looking for your own holes. I fear we're in very great danger of becoming as arrogant in our atheism as theists in their theism, and what having spent my 20s sort of trying to defeat the theist, I then thought, actually, that's not, is it like Alain de Botton says, it's the easiest thing in the world to prove there's no God in the sort of Dawkins-esque simplified God. So what I've tried to do, because I've traveled a lot and I've met loads of wonderful religious people who and I started to think that as a chemist, when you learn basic chemistry, you have like the hydrogen and the oxygen, the two hydrogens, like balls on sticks. Everybody knows that's a load of nonsense. It's absolute rubbish. But that's your first stage in a process towards learning something greater. Then you go into, like, you have iron, the sort of electron shells, but that's absolute bollocks too. When you get each level you go to, you learn something deeper. And what it starts to make me think is that a lot of these obvious nonsenses are necessary for certain routes towards a knowledge of the unknown. Now, you've put your finger, I think, beautifully on the one thing we can agree that we don't know is, like, how it all started. Why are we here? Why was there a Big Bang? But where we're in danger, and I tried very hard not to do this, but not coming from a point of view of having a God, I still think there's a great use in thankfulness and the art of saying thank you to, when the pale blue dot, let's be thankful for it. And you don't have to be theistic to do it, but let's say, if we're standing back and trying to be, not to dismiss theists, just say they're putting the word God on this sort of on the unknown.
So the question of why do I do this sort of thing? Why do I unpick? May be relevant here. So, I think truth and a more objectively true understanding of the world, for want of a better term, it is beneficial, because I think if you can start believing falsehoods, then that can lead to trouble.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
when you get anti-vaxxers and climate science denialists and so on and so forth, then you have problems. So I think that's really important. And when you look at something like Christianity, well, why bother unpicking Christianity? Well, because actually Christianity is a moral value system. And very often it intersects, it has ramifications to me as a non-Christian, so therefore, or to other people around the world. And being a moral value system, if it's morally harmful, it's important to unpick the truth claims involved with it. And so therefore, I think why I do that is effectively to get us towards a greater truth and to make the world a better place. And it sounds quite highfalutin, but that's it. And I think that's part of the journey. I think that is necessary to allow us to be to the world to be a better place. And I think when you look at Alain de Botton, was an interesting choice there, because his Atheism 2.0 was about taking the best parts of religion, like the music and the architecture and stuff like that, and saying, let's not just throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are elements of religion that are really nice and useful, and we can take that and incorporate that into atheism. So that's why you get the Sunday assembly and these kind of ideas of, like, we still need community, we still need to bring people together socially. So for a lot of people, religion provides a social networking basis that if we're going to get rid of religion or the God idea, we need to replace that social cohesion and identity and networking and community with something else. So I think that's why we need to get past the God idea and think about how we bring people together under common identity and common beliefs about making the world a better place. And that's why humanism, I think, is more than just atheism. It's saying, right, okay, you start with the basis of atheism, but that does nothing. That tells you nothing. You need add-ons, and that's where you need to do philosophy and moral philosophy, and then you work out humanism, and hopefully humanism does a better job of being able to replace Christianity than just debunking Christianity. You need to replace some of those needs that humans have with something else.
Bravo.
Well, communism?
No.
Communism, did you say?
That's another ism, isn't it?
Well, you know, I suppose whatever ism you take on, I suppose, so the job is always, what's your goal? The goal, I would have thought, would be something like the best world you can live in. So if communism gets you to the best world you can live in, depending on what metric you can agree on, then go for it. I doubt it will. So maybe there needs to be another ism. This is about moral goal setting. You can't start saying you should act like this without knowing where you're going to go. This is, and I know Julian's probably going to want to get going, so I'll just wrap this up really quickly. But this is protasis and apodosis. These are two elements of a conditional sentence. If I do this, then I do this. So what we need to say is, if we want the world to look like this, we need to do this. So our job is to work out what world we want first before we can start saying this is what we should do. Politics is what we should do on a societal level as a group of individuals, right? So politics is just morality. So in order to do your politics, you need to work out what world you want first. So we need to agree on what the world should look like. Our job, and no one does this, people go on Question Time and they're arguing about, oh, let's do this, let's do that, and they don't like take it down, because when you get down, you say, because this is the world I want. So what you have to do is set out what's the world you want first. Do we all agree on that? We all agree that that's the world we want. Now we can work towards how we get that world. And that's when you get politics up here, individual morality, politics, come out of where you want to be. Our big question is, what do you want the world to look like? 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? What do you want it to look like? And then we can go about trying to do that.